One moment, it's a little low. Hi everybody. Oh, that's way better. Good afternoon. Welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name is Katie O'Donnell. I'm an event staffer here at Politics and Prose, where we now host in person, as you can see, and virtual events, along with partnered and supported trips, events, and classes. For a full list of everything that we offer, you can go to our website at politics-prose.com. So before we get started today, a couple housekeeping items. If you would please take a moment to silence your cell phones so as to not disrupt the event, that would be greatly appreciated. And while we have lifted the mask mandate here in the store, you are encouraged to still wear a mask throughout the entirety of the event, and we do have them available at the front of the store for your convenience. When we get to the portion of the conversation this afternoon for audience questions, we placed a standing microphone at the end of the aisle, which is here to the pillar, which is kind of blocked by y'all's view here, but there is a microphone here. We do ask that you please line up at the mic so that everybody can hear your question, as well as the audio is captured in our live stream of today's event. Following the Q&A, we will have a signing up here at this table. So if you have not already purchased the book, we do have copies available up at the front behind the registers, back left of the store there. We will begin the signing line at this same pillar. So without further ado, the better part of this introduction, I'm very excited to welcome to Politics and Prose today John Farrell, celebrating the release of Ted Kennedy, A Life. John Farrell is the former national political reporter, White House correspondent, and Washington editor for the Boston Globe. He is the author of Richard Nixon, The Life, which won the Penn Jacqueline Bograd Weld Award for biography and the New York Historical Society Barbara and David Zelaznik Book Prize in American History. It was the finalist also for the Pulitzer Prize in 2018. And in 2001, he published Tip O'Neill and the Democratic Century, which won the D.B. Hardman Prize for the best book on Congress. His book, Clarence Darrow, Attorney for the Damned, won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for biography in 2011. He has also earned a George Polk Award, the Gerald R. Ford Prize, and the White House Correspondents Association honors for his coverage of the presidency. Farrell will be joined today in conversation with Molly Ball, Time Magazine's national political correspondent and frequent television and radio commentator. She is the author of Pelosi, a best-selling biography of the first woman Speaker of the House. Prior to joining Time, Ball covered U.S. politics for The Atlantic, Politico, and the Las Vegas Review-Journal. She has received numerous awards for her political coverage, including the Dirksen Award for Distinguished Reporting of Congress, the Gerald R. Ford Prize for Distinguished Reporting on the Presidency, and the Toner Prize for Excellence in Political Reporting. So please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, John Farrell and Molly Ball.
I have a feeling I can't get away with anything today. There's too many familiar faces in the audience.
And too many political junkies in the audience. They'll catch you. Well, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you so much for this amazing book. Let's get right into it. Can you talk a little bit about how and why you came to this subject? What motivated you to take on such a big and intimidating topic, and how you approached it?
Well, I would like to give you some wonderful, inspiring answer to that, but the fact of the matter is it was for money. An editor at my publishing house came to me and said, 12 years ago, would you like to do a book on Richard Nixon? And I said, you bet. If you get a chance to do a president, you do a president. And when that book was finished, the same editor came to me and said, how about Ted Kennedy? And there's lots of caveats. My good friend, the late Adam Clymer, had done a biography of Ted, and we shared an agent, and I had actually helped in his book. And so I went to him. I took him out to dinner and asked him if he would feel bad. And I said, look, I'm not going to do this if you have any qualms whatsoever. And God bless him. He said, I'll think about it. And 24 hours later, I got an email, not just with a good luck and knock 'em dead message, but also 2 pages of sources and phone numbers and people to contact. So that's how I got into it. Once I got into it and COVID came along and sort of kept me out of all the archives, I wondered whether or not I would stay with it, because you have to have something new to say, and there have been exceptional books written about Ted Kennedy. The Boston Globe did a great group biography at the time of his death. Adam had done one. There's another one out right now by a fellow named Neil Gabler. And so I had to bet on myself that I could go out and, with the help of my ace researcher who's here, whom I'm blessed with, find enough stuff in the archives to say something new. And I hope I did so. I think the inspiring part about his story is his resilience. In many ways, he went through just an awful, tragic life. It's a very sad book in many places, but he keeps pushing and pushing and pushing. And somewhere along the line, I decided that I didn't believe, and I don't think he believed in redemption, but I do believe, and I think he believed in atonement. And I think that's the second part of his life after Chappaquiddick.
That's such a fascinating analysis. Before we get into all of that, can you talk a little bit also about your personal connection to the subject, having been with the Globe? And there's this wonderful moment about the shark in the book. So can you tell that story?
Yeah, the first time I met Ted Kennedy, I was the new Globe congressional reporter, and I was sent up to the Hill and to cover some sort of hearing, and he came out of the hearing room, and I walked up to him thinking that this was going to be the beginning of a very important relationship as the hometown newspaper's congressional reporter, and he brushed me off, and he said, yeah, we'll get you the quote, and he walked away, and I was like, fuck you. So we didn't, and then 3 weeks later, I think it was a Friday night or a Saturday morning, I get this phone call, and there's been a rape on the Kennedy family property down in Palm Beach, Florida, and I get on an airplane, and the New York tabloids had just come off strike. So this was the first tasty morsel that they could scrap for. So I'm down there with the New York Post and the New York Daily News, the Boston Herald, Newsday, and it's a media frenzy like I had never seen before, and I learned a lot at that, even though I had been a reporter probably for 20 years at that time, and it forced me then, as the delegation reporter, the congressional reporter, to go back to Ted time and time again and say, what about this? How about your effectiveness? Are you drinking too much? And I got to see him, and we developed a sort of a relationship under fire, and I grew to like him better. And at one point, I wrote in the Globe an analogy which said that he is so consumed by sorrow that he has to keep swimming like a shark, because if a shark stops swimming, it drowns. And Ted Kennedy had to keep moving all the time, because otherwise he would drown in sorrow. And I got this little note back from him a couple of days later saying, thanks for the nice piece. I found it fair. And it was signed with a little doodle of a shark. And it said, Ted the Shark. So
You seem to have a penchant for nautical doodles. There's various moments where he's bored and drawing sailboats during a hearing or that kind of thing, always sort of dreaming of the sea.
And that's a really good point, because we talk so much about his personal foibles and his womanizing and his drinking, and most of the time he managed to keep it out of his public life. But notably in that summer was also the Clarence Thomas Anita Hill hearings, and Ted Kennedy was sitting next to Joe Biden. By the way, thank you all for leaving the White House wedding early and coming over. But he was sitting next to Joe Biden, and he might as well have had a bag over his head, because he was so compromised that he could not address this particular subject or topic. So that was a very good case where the private lapsed over into the public and caused the Globe, among other people, to say, we always gave him a pass before, but now here's a case where he couldn't keep the private sins from affecting his public behavior, and we don't know whether we can support him for another term. And then there was this bright young guy named Mitt Romney who ran against him, and for the summer of 1994, it was a question as to whether or not he could win re-election.
Well, and that tension really animates this incredible portrait of Ted Kennedy, and so to go back to the very beginning, it's almost difficult to read about his early life, right? Because this incredible privilege that he's born into is juxtaposed with this incredible abandonment, where it seems almost as if nobody raised him. And he was sent to boarding school at the age of 7. It's heartbreaking to think, for me at least, of my 7-year-old being, sent away. So can you talk a little bit about the way his early life and how you think that shaped him?
I think it shaped them all. The father, Joseph Kennedy, was this amazing, fantastically rich man who decided that he was not going to live his life with the same rules that other Irish Americans from Massachusetts did. He was going to live his life like a Rockefeller or a Roosevelt, and that gave him the freedom to roam the country, buy companies, go out to Hollywood, be a mogul out there, have affairs. And still come back and pretend in Massachusetts that he was this big family man and groom his children with the straightest teeth and the natural good looks they had to be the thing that he could not be, which was President of the United States. And so he was a person he was very charismatic, and he put a lot of expectations and pressure on the kids. Rose, because of her own relationship with him, and because of her very deep religious beliefs, bordering on bordering on the crazy, was a very cold and absent mother. And also, to give her credit, she had 9 children, which meant that that if she wasn't staggering around pregnant with the next kid, she still had 4 or 5 little toddlers that she had to deal with. And given her wealth, she fled that a lot. And there's a famous comment by JFK when he was like 6 years old and she was taking off to go somewhere, and JFK says, "Yeah, you're some kind of a mother, leaving your kids," which said a lot about how precocious he was. But Ted then comes along, and he's the 9th. And there's very interesting interviews with Rose in which she's asked about him, and she tells reporters from Time magazine, when the 9th comes along, you really find it hard to sit there and read a bedtime story or go and watch the kids go sledding. It's just a pain in the neck and that was Ted. And so when JFK died, and this was something that stunned me because the Kennedys were so good at manufacturing an image. When JFK died, Jacqueline Kennedy had that famous interview with Teddy White, in which she told the story about Camelot that became the myth for all of us, and cast the new frontier in this King Arthur terms. And but part of that conversation that was deleted and not released until just several years ago was when Jackie talks about Rose, and she said to Theodore White 3 days after her husband has been assassinated, she never loved him. She went around talking about being the daughter of the mayor of Boston or the wife of the ambassador to Great Britain, but she never loved him. And then there's a pause, and just to make sure that the transcript is correct and that Theodore White understands it, she leans over and she says, she never loved him. So it was a very cold family life behind the image of touch football and all those amazing teeth and that beautiful hair and energy that they projected. Yeah.
And yet he makes the decision to go into politics. It doesn't seem like it's completely his decision, right? And there's a moment where he almost decides not to. How do you think that calculation went on in his mind with, the burden of family and all that he'd already been through by the time he, as still a very young man, commits himself to a life in the public arena?
Yeah. From the day he could reason until the day he died, family was the overriding value for Ted Kennedy. The warm family movements that he tried to recapture after things went bad and cold, the way he idolized Jack and Joe Jr. and then later after they both died, the way he idolized and was devoted to Robert, and then all of a sudden, here's this kid who's the 9th, and he's sort of the fattest, and he's not the smartest, and his parents don't mind telling that to reporters, believe it or not, because they had 3 others that they were grooming, and so Ted's not as sharp as the other 3, but we'll find a place for him somewhere. And then all of a sudden, they're all gone, and the crown falls on the jester's brow, and he's expected to carry on. And then at a time when all the hijinks that the father and the brothers could get away with are no longer acceptable because standards are changing about womanizing, about political cleverness, and so in the bright light of this amazing media in which the Kennedys become, the equal of Marilyn or Elvis, for the rest of his life he has to operate under that glare with the huge expectations and try to live up to this legacy. And he several times in his career he cracks and he fails.
Yeah, and one of those, of course, is Chappaquiddick, which is the sort of enduring scar on his whole story. And you uncovered a significant bit of new information about that. Can you talk about how you found it and how it struck you in the moment, and what light you think it sheds on that episode and what it means to Ted Kennedy's life?
Well, what I found was when Arthur Schlesinger Jr., famous historian and aide to the Kennedys, died, his sons published a significant portion of his diary, 500 pages. But that was 500 pages out of, I think, 9,000. And so back when I was working on the Nixon book, I had gone and paged through those unpublished pages and found interesting stuff. And maybe something clicked up in here that if you ever do a Kennedy book, this is like the mother lode. And sure enough, I got the contract to do the Ted Kennedy book, and I went to the New York Public Library, and I started going through there, and I found that after Chappaquiddick, Arthur Schlesinger had been overseas, and he went to the compound, and he talked to Ted, and he talked to Ted's sister Jean, and he talked to Jean's husband, Stephen Smith, all 3 of whom Schlesinger was close to, and they told him basically what almost every investigative reporter in the country suspected, which was that Ted's initial reaction was to try to cover it up. So if there's a little piece of the puzzle that I add to the historical puzzle that I add, it's by putting this in Ted's own mouth as he in the week after Chappaquiddick talks to Jean and talks to Arthur and talks to Steve and said, there was this half-assed attempt to pretend that somebody else was driving, or that Mary Jo was driving by her. Mary Jo Kopechne was the poor girl that died. Was driving by herself, and it all fell apart very quickly the next morning. But it was part of the reason why he delayed going to the authorities for 10 hours after the accident.
And how do you think that affected the rest of his life and career? Because on the one hand, he had to spend so many years continuing to explain and to atone and giving speeches and reconnecting with his constituency and so on, and his public image never fully recovered. But on the other hand, he didn't seem to learn, right? The recklessness continued. He continued to behave in a lot of risky ways, correct?
And that was evident in the year before Chappaquiddick. After Robert was killed, full weight of the glare comes onto Ted. He runs and becomes the Democratic whip in the Senate. And that spring of 1969, it's just frenetic. He's going everywhere. He's dashing out to march with the farm workers in Los Angeles. He's going to Memphis for the 1-year anniversary of the King assassination. And what's really interesting is that the reporters who are traveling with him are writing notes. These were the days where if you were a reporter traveling with someone, a public official, you didn't talk about their private foibles unless something happened like Chappaquiddick. So they're writing to their editors and they're saying, this guy is heading for a crack up. He's drinking too much. Just, be prepared, because very soon this is Time magazine, this is Newsweek, very soon we're going to have to start writing about another Kennedy disaster. So it's coming, and then it continues after Chappaquiddick as well. And the question is, how much of it was self-sabotage? Mm-hmm. This is not a unique Jack Farrell insight. This is something that Ellen Goodman at the Boston Globe and Anthony Lewis at the New York Times and others all immediately, his best friend, John Tunney, all immediately asked, is there a self-destructive element to all this, that he doesn't feel that he's worthy of being the Kennedy who becomes president, and so every time he approaches it, he finds a way to sabotage his own chances. And in the 1980 presidential race, and there we actually have some veterans who covered that race here, Tom Oliphant. As Ted gets closer, he performs worse, and the further he gets away, the better he performs. And of course, the classic moment in that race is the Roger Mudd interview, where Roger Mudd comes to the Cape and asks him some very basic questions, and Ted starts going, and he's not prepared. And preparation was always key for him. And Warren Rudman, one of his colleagues in the Senate, sees this and says, "Oh my God, he doesn't want it. He wants this to pass, and he's going to bring the House down around himself so he doesn't have to bear this burden." So, and another very interesting element of, in addition to risk and whatever, since the search for sensation.
And then when it's slipping away from him is when he sort of rises to the occasion, right? Sort of to your point. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that there's many in the audience who remember the speech at the convention after he had lost, where he talks about the dream shall never die, the cause goes on, and he really, I think, in that speech, cements himself as the key American liberal, running against the moderate Carter, and it was a very memorable occasion and a moment that, if you go on YouTube now, it'll send little chills down your spine even so now.
How do you think about his ideology, his political philosophy? Because when you talk about the background that he came from, he very easily could have been a Mitt Romney, right? He could have decided that to side with basically the rich folks that he came from. So why become not just a liberal, but a passionate liberal and an ally of the little guy? Where either in his character or in his history do you think he got that?
I think that definitely comes from the Irish American experience in Massachusetts. Even though he never experienced it himself, they heard from Rose and from Joe and from others, from his grandfather, Honey Fitz, about the No Irish Need Apply signs and the discrimination felt by Joe when he wanted to join a country club and he was blackballed in Massachusetts and decided to pack the family up on a private railroad car and go to Manhattan, where Ted was born, actually, in New York. And so there was that. I mean, Jack and Bobby were both challenged about it, and said, "You guys were born rich kids. You can't claim that discrimination." They both said, "No, this was part of the milieu in which we grew up. It was part of our character." And one of the guys that I talked to was a guy named Charles Daly, and he had worked at one point or another for all three of the brothers. And I got to make sure I pause and get this right. And he said they were well-fed underdogs with plenty of bite. And that was the best description, I think, of the Kennedys. But that's where it came from. Now, he was also his father's son. And once he got to the Senate, what strikes you just overwhelmingly is the pragmatism and the ability to look at the Senate and say, after Watergate, for example, I can go and get the minority leader Hugh Scott because the Republicans desperately need an issue, and we're going to pass this campaign finance bill that on the next day's front page of the New York Times says will end the influence of special interest money in American politics forever. Right, well, and there's another lesson to be learned by that, which he learned later on in a fight over the Voting Rights Act, which is that these battles are not won forever. They have to be fought over and over and over again. But let's see. Richard Nixon, the war on cancer, almost healthcare reform. Ronald Reagan, nuclear disarmament, and an extension of the Voting Rights Act for 25 years with Ronald Reagan and Bob Dole in 1981. That's pretty amazing stuff when you look at the Senate today. Immigration, education, and the Medicare drug standard. Alan Simpson and John McCain, immigration. Dole and Orrin Hatch, the two huge historic AIDS packages that moved through the Senate by defeating Jesse Helms, who was probably the only Republican that Ted Kennedy could not work with. And just time and time again, you see this model of reaching across the aisle, finding the right guy. The American Disabilities Act with George Herbert Warren-Bush. It is stunning as you chronicle it, and going in thinking that I'm going to write about the lion of liberalism, he really becomes the lion of pragmatism, and all these accomplishments in both Democratic and Republican administrations are stunning. And they're all summed up by his relationship with Orrin Hatch. Now, you could not find somebody who was less like Ted Kennedy than Orrin Hatch, the straight-laced Mormon bishop from Utah, very conservative, came to the U.S. Senate, as he wrote in his own memoir, with the idea that he was going to do everything he could to stop Ted Kennedy, and ended up instead passing child health, AIDS, all these different healthcare legislations, and they developed a very interesting sort of acute relationship between the two of them, so that Ted would come in one night with Chris Dodd after a night of rousing and celebrating for a late session of the Senate, and Orrin would grab him and say, "Ted, the Mormon bishops are gathering in Boston in 2 months. Would you mind addressing them and get Faneuil Hall for us?" And Ted says, "Oh, yeah, sure. And then the next morning, he realizes what he's done, and he comes up to Hatch and he says, "Orrin, I just got one question for you." He says, "What else did I promise you last night?"
So I want to talk a little bit about his relationship with Nixon, in part because, you seem so uniquely poised to understand that dynamic. And it's, to me, one of the most fascinating episodes of the book, or several chapters of the book. And there's a quote, I guess Nixon's quoting someone else, but he felt so threatened by Kennedy throughout his presidency, and tried so hard to destroy him because he saw him as a threat. And I guess he's quoting someone else, but he says at some point, "Jack was bright and Bobby was tough. This fellow is neither." I wonder if you think there's a grain of truth in that assessment, and if so, and so I guess this is more a question about how he was always compared to his brothers. But if so, if there was something else that he had, right? Because he did have the sort of the personability that you're describing, the ability to work with others, that maybe that was his special sauce. What do you think?
There's very few American figures, I guess Lyndon Johnson is perhaps the most noteworthy, who can prosper in both the U.S. Senate and in the White House. JFK and Robert, both of them were not legislators. They were guys who used the Senate as a forum to advance their ideals and their causes, but didn't necessarily push any legislation through. Ted had this marvelous affability. His father said he was as affable as an Irish cop, which fit very well in the Senate. And being the ninth of 9 children, he was also really good in a chamber that ran on seniority. He knew how to keep the older guys happy, and to be respectful, and to follow them around, and to do what they said, and to listen to their counsel. And so he was a much better senator than either of the two brothers. Now, that was part 2 of the question. What was the first part of the question?
The first part of the question was about the relationship with Nixon, and,
with Nixon,
how that
right,
all played out.
Yeah. And so by 1968, when Nixon is elected president, Robert Kennedy has been killed, but Nixon is still scarred by the 1960 race, in which he's convinced that the Kennedys and Jack Kennedy stole the election from him. And so he's paranoid, literally, about Ted Kennedy, I say in the book that he approaches Ted Kennedy with the same amount of affection and dread that Captain Cook did with the ticking crocodile. It was just, someday he was going to be there looking for a leg or an arm. But Nixon being a very interesting character, after Chappaquiddick, Ted Kennedy comes to the White House and Nixon calls him aside and says, Ted, nobody is done until they quit. You're not done when you're defeated. You're done only when you quit. And don't trust the press. They're never going to be your friends. And so it's just like this really strange, warm moment. And it's followed up when Ted Kennedy's son, Ted Jr., gets cancer. And at the age of, I think, 12, is in the hospital and he's going to have his leg removed. And he gets a phone call from the President of the United States, Richard Nixon, saying, same thing. Ted, you're not down. Only, pull through. You can do this. And so it was a strange relationship. It was head-scratching in many ways. Fear of Ted Kennedy helped directly lead to Watergate. And then Nixon gets reelected in 1972, and Watergate breaks, and the economy is awful. And Nixon decides that he needs to distract people and show that he can still govern. And so he reaches out to Ted Kennedy, and there's this great moment in American history in the spring of 1974, where Ted Kennedy and his people are negotiating with Richard Nixon's people in the basement of a church on Capitol Hill. And they come this close to reaching a deal on national health care insurance. And it falls apart for various reasons, and not the least of which is that that was the fall that the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee decided that Wilbur Mills decided that he was going to go swimming in the tidal basin with Fanny Fox, the Argentine firecracker, and the moment passes. But Ted, if you asked him as a reporter, what was your biggest legislative mistake, he would always come back and say, I didn't take the deal with Nixon. And flash forward to the Affordable Care Act, and he's in this room with Obama at the White House, and he only has 6 months to live, and they're about to move out into the East Room to fire up the troops, and he says to Obama, he says, this is the moment, Mr. President, don't miss the moment. And he does a number of other wonderful things, which are chronicled in this wonderful book about Speaker Pelosi by Molly Ball, including writing a letter that it will be delivered to Obama posthumously, so that his memory becomes an inspiration to them working hard on the Affordable Care Act. So even though he's not there, even though he's Moses and he has to look across the River Jordan at the Promised Land, when it's finally passed, when it's finally signed, there's a party at the White House, and Obama leaves the party, goes back up to the residence, and he says in his memoir, I thought of my mother who died of breast cancer, and I thought of Ted Kennedy. So even in death, he was doing this. And I'm going to say this because he would want me to say it. Look at campaign finance reform. Look at the Voting Rights Act. And if you think that the Affordable Care and Health Care for All has been achieved for us, it has, but it's going to have to be defended over and over and over again in the days to come, because these battles are not won forever. Mm-hmm. They have to be won over and over again.
Yeah. Well, I hope everybody's thinking of brilliant questions to ask. I'm going to throw it open after this. But so reflect a little bit on that sort of late period Ted Kennedy, because as you describe that interaction with Nixon, it's almost as if Nixon was inviting him to share in his paranoia and bitterness. And Kennedy never succumbed to that, right? As much as you describe how he was never fully in touch with his emotions, didn't like sort of introspection and talking about these things, but he also never became bitter. And eventually sort of settles into this godfather role in American liberalism, right? Helping to bring Obama to the presidency and serving as an inspiration, I think, for a lot of liberals, even as he sometimes didn't go far enough for them. So how would you describe that, the sort of figure he became later in life?
Well, I think one thing that I let him off the hook, I think, a little bit on is the fact that in his no-holds-barred, disastrous personal and political relationship with Jimmy Carter in 1980, he helped give us Ronald Reagan, which was a betrayal of the lion of liberalism. If what he really believed was the liberal cause, that he knew that Carter would be better than Reagan, but the personal had become the political by that point for a number of reasons. The Carter people had hated the Kennedy people since before Jimmy ran in 1976. The enmity was always there, ready to lap over. Pat Caddell, who worked for them both, said, "I spent the 4 years of the Carter White House trying to keep these two trains that were heading for each other from colliding, and I failed." So I mean, the Iranians took over the embassy and the economy was awful. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan. There were lots of reasons why Carter lost. But one of the three that, when I interviewed Carter, that he said was the liberal challenge from Ted Kennedy. So yeah, that there was a certain element of pettiness and bitterness that he could not get over when it was put before him. He was, after all, Joseph Kennedy's son and Bobby Kennedy's brother. So that there was that within him. The late in life magnanimity is just it's stunning. I mean, there's this great moment where he and John McCain, if there's ever two bulls of the Senate that you would think would not get along very well, it would be those two. And they get in an argument on the Senate floor, and they put down the microphone, and they go down to the well, which is in front of the dais. And, of course, that's right below where the wire services reporters are, and so they can lean over. And to their immense delight, McCain and Kennedy start going on it on the Senate floor, saying, "Fuck you, John. Well, fuck you, Ted." Then they walked out, and Ted Kennedy threw his arm around John McCain and said, John, I think we went a little bit too far there, and it was the beginning, at the end of Casablanca, it was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. So he just had that ability of winning people over, and like I said, there were very few, until the Gingrich era began, and really sort of that nastiness that has taken over Congress sort of spelled what was going to be the end of the lion's ability to reach across the aisle. He had a magnificent run where all these bills got passed. By the time the Affordable Care Act was ready to be passed, you have to think about what Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch had already put in place between Hillary Care, which failed, and Obamacare, which passed, and they had, between them and W on the Medicare drug prescription, they had put a huge chunk of what national health care was going to be in place already, and that made it easier for Pelosi and Obama to push the CARE Act through.
All right, if you have a question, please come up to this microphone right here so that everybody can hear you. Don't all line up at once. I'm happy to continue grilling this guy if you don't have any questions. And so I will do that. But if you have a question, please come up to the microphone, and I'll turn it over to you to ask. For me, one of the most affecting moments in the book, while we wait for people to come up, is when you write about how his marriage to Vicky did so much to settle and stabilize him and allow him to sort of find peace, I guess, in his later life. And there's a moment where he's talking about something he's done in his usual sort of self-deprecating way. Well, a lot of people were part of this, I can't take all the credit. And she jumps in and urges him to take that credit. And it was that moment where I felt like, wow, until she came along, nobody really took care of him. Do you think that's true?
Well, certainly for reasons on both sides of the marriage. The first marriage was disastrous, and that he was not getting that kind of comfort from that relationship. To what extent Joan's alcoholism stemmed from his philandering, or to what extent he was egged on by the fact that her alcoholism made their house, like Gene Kennedy Smith said, like something out of a Eugene O'Neill play. That was not a happy time. And even after the divorce after the 1980 campaign, and he sets off on these 10 years of bad boy Ted as a bachelor in a womanizer and in some cases drunkard. He sees that two things happen. One is I think that he burns out a lot, and so when Vicky comes along, he's ready for that kind of a partner. But also I think that part of him, the political part of him, says, I really do need to get my, act together. His kids had a intervention with him, and so it wasn't, just politics. It was also personal and within the family, and I think that I've found very little bad to say about Vicky, and what I didn't put in the book. I think that she was she was not a great help to me, but she was a help to me, and she was I think a really great help to him.
Please go ahead.
Hello, John. Good to see you again. It's only been 52 years.
Hi, Rich. How are you?
Good. So I'd like you to share with the group what influence Vincent Gibbs and Santa Vidala had on you.
Rich was in my high school class at Robert E. Perry High School, along with Scott. This is the danger of doing this, is because there's people from all different parts of my life, and I can't get away with this kind of stuff. Vincent Gibbs was a wonderful, wonderful drama teacher. In many ways, we probably can agree that that there were parts of our high school career which were vast wastelands as far as intellectual accomplishment. But there were these two, and Miss Vidala was the other one. There were these two English teachers who worked very hard at encouraging and identifying the kids who they thought might be frustrated by the general intellectual tone of the high school in Rockville. And they did things like they played silent movies of Romeo and Juliet at night, and then they would play Stravinsky as the soundtrack and explain to us who Stravinsky was, and forced us to read Faulkner. And by the time I got to college, I had an inkling in the back of my mind that I wanted to be a writer. So
Right. And the reunion was 6 weeks ago, guys. So I got your information. You'll be hearing from me.
Okay, thanks, Rich.
You had a question?
Anybody from UVA want to come
Okay.
up?
As someone who knows so much about the personal lives of politicians, and you remarked that there was a before and now we're all dealing with the after, to what degree do you think that personal charisma, however you want to describe that word, could, and we've seen a previous president who had an enormous charisma, perhaps not with the best results, can help our country forward? And Lyndon Johnson was a perfect example that you don't need to have charisma to do that.
One thing that I came away with doing this book was, if you can believe it, for a Irish Catholic kid from Long Island who grew up at the time of the New Frontier and watched John Kennedy run for office, I came away with even a greater appreciation for the New Frontier and what he meant in 1959 and 1960, especially on civil rights. In many ways, both Kennedys had to be dragged, both Bobby and Jack had to be dragged kicking and screaming into the civil rights movement, by the activists themselves, by Martin Luther King, by the kids in Birmingham. They just kept pushing it in their faces, saying this is not something you can duck because it's a bad political card. You got to play it. And to their credit, a few months before he died, JFK aligns the American presidency with the cause of civil rights, which was something that Eisenhower was not willing to do, and makes this amazing speech in which, believe it or not, this is this amazing speech about civil rights to the country. The first time a president has done this, I believe, and part of it. He's ad-libbing because they didn't finish the speech in time, and so it was charisma, but there was also idealism. They were well-fed underdogs, and they had bite, but that underdog part never I believe, left them. And I think that there's a reason why JFK is always listed high on the ranks of American presidents, even though a lot of the things that he pushed did not come into fruition until after the assassination and after Lyndon Johnson pushed them through Congress, like the Civil Rights Act, like Medicare, other bills. But if you go back and you watch the debate between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy, the single most important moment of the 1960 race, and in the middle of it, all of a sudden, JFK spontaneously brings up the rights of Black Americans. So it wasn't something that they ducked, entirely. He was looking for votes, but it wasn't something that they ducked entirely. But it was something that they would have liked. It was a cup that they would like to have passed. Yeah.
Forgive me, I guess I didn't express the question. To what degree do you think that charisma in today's world would be effective, or can be effective?
Yeah. I don't think so. I think, for one thing, the media has changed. The media gives much more scrutiny to charismatic, and we've become much more hyperpolarized now. I think that Obama certainly had great charisma and used it well at the beginning of his term, but stalled. And in his own way, Donald Trump had a charisma that appealed to a segment of the American people, but may turn out to have been catastrophic for the Republican Party. So, yeah.
Hi,
Yes,
how
go
you
ahead.
doing? Good. I have a question for you that relates to the past and the future. What impact do you think the activities and the success of Robert and of John will have on the future generation for political success for their successors, their family successors?
It's tough, but that's one reason that I wanted to write the book, because when you're a writer and you're looking for themes that still resonate, it's stunning how quick we forget. To many people who are the age of my kids, Ted Kennedy is Mayor Quimby from Springfield in The Simpsons, and that's all. And John F. Kennedy is the guy who Marilyn Monroe sang Happy Birthday to. And it's one reason I think that people like me feel that we have, a cause or a reason to write this stuff. But, there's a great line in Profiles in Courage where John Kennedy says, these are old stories. There's holes in all of them, but they have the ability to inspire. John Kennedy said that the problems that face us are huge. This is the height of the Cold War, so in many ways they're worse than what we face now. But they're human problems. They're made by human beings, and because they're human problems, they can be met by human solutions. And that kind of optimism is something that I think is missing, and I tried to convey in the book.
Can I ask you another one? Let me ask you about the speech that he gave for his brother at Robert's funeral.
Uh-huh.
Any comments about the history of that, or any comments on that, on the speech he gave for his brother?
Yeah, it was sort of a group effort with his speechwriters. He a large part of it that's forgotten is Ted reciting one of Robert's speeches, which is a famous speech that Robert made in South Africa called the Ripple of Hope speech, which these ripples from the action of one person or several people can spread out and cause major change as the ripples of change go outward. But then there was this, Ted also told the speechwriters, and I want to say something about love as well. And that's the really touching part, where he's, this young man who never was supposed to be in this position, never was trained for it. Nobody ever expected he would be the guy that would have to pick up the fallen standard. And he gives this wonderful speech, and his voice breaks twice when he talks about my brother was not a great man, but he was a good man, and he saw pain and tried to solve it, saw war and tried to stop it. And like he said, some men ask, why, and I ask why not. It's again another touching moment. The great part about being a writer now in the day of YouTube is you can go back and look at it, and be moved all over again by video of it, which unfortunately I couldn't do with somebody like Clarence Darrow.
Well, and as you mentioned in the book, he unfortunately developed quite a talent for giving eulogies because he had a lot of practice at it. But he also seemed to come into his own as a speaker over the course of his life, that he often in unguarded moments could be kind of inarticulate, but then he would give these just soaring, amazing speeches, whether in the Senate or on the campaign trail or somewhere else. Was that something that he was born with, something he acquired? Where did he come to that?
One thing that if you study sort of the technical part of Ted Kennedy's career, it's that because he had doubts about his own ability, and because he had this amazing, cool older brothers, amazingly cool older brothers, he always felt that he had to prepare, he had to rehearse, and so they would have these amazing sessions at his home before every one of those big speeches or big Senate debates, where he would go over and over again and get briefed. What were the questions like? Because he knew he could be inarticulate at moments, and he hated it when it happened, and he didn't want to be embarrassed at a Senate hearing, and so he really worked at preparation, and that's what makes the Roger Mudd thing so fascinating, is that obviously he had not prepared, and the question, why. There are other reasons other than self-sabotage as to why he was unprepared that weekend, but it sort of raises that question, which is very intriguing to a biographer who's trying to get inside that head.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Hi, Jack. I have no idea what the answer is, but can you talk about the relationship between Ted and our current president, the former Senator Joe Biden?
Well, Joe was not a Kennedy. He did not come from a very wealthy family. He came from a state that was more conservative, Pennsylvania and Delaware, than Massachusetts. And from time to time, he would let his frustration with being compared to the Kennedys out. But on the other hand, he was a great, like anybody else of his age group who was especially an Irish American like he was, the Kennedys were great inspirations to him as well. There was, before the debate on the confirmation for Robert Bork, Joe Biden had taken over the Judiciary Committee chairmanship, and he said, trying to prove that he was independent and moderate and not under Ted Kennedy's sway, he said, I could see, to the Philadelphia Inquirer, I could see supporting somebody like Bork. I'm not Ted Kennedy. And so when Bork was appointed and Ted Kennedy fully realized who he was, Teddy was right there on the Senate floor and gave this amazing speech, the intent of which was to tell moderates like Biden that the liberal lion was going to be roaring on this one, and if this is what you want to do, then just be forewarned, this is what you're going to be up against, and I'll be fighting this. I'll be leading the fight. The NAACP and the other liberal groups will be with me, and so sure enough, rather than be a screed against Bork aimed at the Republicans or even mainstream America, this was a signal to the party. This is a hill worth dying on, and I'm going to be leading the charge. What are you going to do, Joe? You want to be president? You got to get those liberal activists in Iowa on your side. You're going to be the guy who said I can support Bork or not. He didn't say this out loud, but this was the message of that speech, and indeed, Biden very quickly came around, and the two of them plotted strategy very well together all that summer and all that fall, and Bork was soundly defeated.
Hey, Jack, how are you?
Hi, John. How are you?
Good to see you. So I have a different kind of a question. It's aimed more at you as opposed to Ted. Can you talk about your evolution as a biographer and lessons that you learned from the first books that helped you with this one?
Yeah. Well, this was a problem child because of COVID. the archives closed halfway through, the ability, I made this confession at the JFK Library the other night, which is that for a reporter, I hate interviewing people over the telephone. And it got to be almost a phobia with me at some points in my career. I much prefer to be in a room where you can read people's faces, where you can try to reach out and make a connection with folks. And that was taken away by COVID as well. So this was, there's a famous quote by Samuel Beckett where he talks about, with each book you just want to fail better. And I hope I failed better with this one, but this was a toughie. Coming out of journalism, I find that I still have little quirks in my writing which are not good, and other stylistic flourishes which are really good. I mean, people tell me all the time, you know, Jack, what's really great about your books is you know what to leave out. And what does that mean? I guess it means that the story is paced well, and you want to keep reading. But that is something that you learn over time. And the thing I think that I've failed at is bringing a real. I try hard, but bringing a real poetry and a lyrical manner to my writing. It's hard with a biography because you're limited by a set plot and facts. And it's also hard when you spend a long time of your career as a journalist, cranking out 300 stories a year under a very rigid format. But there's always the next one, and the next one I am determined is going to be lyrical like you'd never believe.
Do we have time for one more?
One more question, yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you for this wonderful book, John. I wanted to ask you about Ted Kennedy's diaries. We learned at some point, I think, over the past few years, maybe even from you, that he was a meticulous diarist in writing, and I think also in audio and recordings of his own voice. And I got the sense from your article in the New York Times about the Alito confirmation that you had access to fragments of it that were copied and stored elsewhere. I just wonder if you could characterize his diary and his sort of style as a diarist, and also your relationship to it in your research.
Yeah. Well, like I said, when I talked to my friend Adam Clymer, late Adam Clymer, he said, the first thing he said was, get the diaries. If you can get the diaries, get the diaries. Because we all knew, if I, for my Tip O'Neill book, for example, when I wanted to interview Ted Kennedy, I knew that he would send his aides up to the JFK Library and look for instances in the diary so that he could answer my question, that Ted could answer my question accurately. And so it was used like that. And the reason I was able to get segments of the diary for my book was that very often aides, being somewhat sloppy, would not send the stuff back to the JFK Library, or they would make Xeroxes of it and stick it in their own files, which would end up at the National Archives. So that Ted Kennedy, coming home from Vietnam, speaks into a tape recorder about the trip that he's just taken, seeing the war in Vietnam and how he's going to change positions on the war. It is transcribed, it's given to a speechwriter, then it's slipped into that speechwriter's file rather than being sent back to the JFK Library, so Jack Farrell can find it, and 40 years later. But that doesn't mean that, I got some significant glimpses at that diary by being thorough with the help of my researcher. But the sum of those 40 years of American politics and these dictations someday are going to be just one hell of a book, and nobody, I don't think, can make the claim that they've written a definitive biography of Ted Kennedy until they have access to this kind of look at the internal. It's not like he's in there saying, oh, I thought about Bobby today, and oh my God, my relationship with my wife is so awful. It's not that kind of a diary, but it's the kind of diary where every once in a while, because he's Ted Kennedy, he does give a glimpse of his heart and his soul when he's talking about his public life.
Seems like a good note to end on. Thank you, everyone, so much for coming. Jack's going.